enjoying a day on Sydney Harbour. And as you can see, there's a lot of wealth here. But how many of you knew what Australia's biggest business was? How many of you knew that Australia's biggest business, the thing that provides a lot of money for these toys here and their rich executives, is actually blood? And the blood products company, CSL. You know, these guys have got a market capitalisation of $140 billion, making them by far and away Australia's biggest business. But how many of you knew that they're also Australia's biggest killers? That's right, this company CSL are hiding a secret. Australia's deadliest medical scandal, bar none, was created by these guys. In the 1980s, they knowingly distributed contaminated blood to Australian patients. Not that you'll ever hear it on the ABC. That's right, our public broadcaster has been captured by these guys. The ABC are more likely to tell you the virtues of CSL than they're ever going to tell you about the 1,400 people that died at the hands of this company. Well, we're about to change all of that. Very soon, Effective Blood Australia is going to be releasing CSL's biggest secret. Why does it matter? This company have been selected as the manufacturer for the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. We oppose that. We oppose it because CSL have failed in their duty of candour. They failed to tell us that they knowingly distributed contaminated blood to children here in Australia in the 1980s, and parents lost children. These guys are for the high jump. So stick with us and watch the evidence of evidence as we demand justice from this terrible blight on Australia, this company, CSL.
Charles, hello. How are you, mate?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Oh, mate, I'm good. I tell you what, every time I watch that video now, I get tingles. Unbelievable.
Well, yeah, every time I get it, I get a mixture of tingles and regret because we're being heavily hacked or attempts to hack us on all our accounts ever since that video went to social media.
Well, it's funny you mention that because, you know, when you put that video up, and, you know, I love trying to promote anything that you've done because your story is unbelievable. You've been doing this now for over 30 years?
Since 1988, I've been, in one way or another, fighting contaminated blood.
My God. See, I don't know if you can see my screen there, but when I actually recorded that off your YouTube, so I didn't link to it. Have a look at this screenshot here. I've never had this happen to me. It says, this video has been deleted. Now, instead of normally you might get a warning, but they can't. So what's happening here? And at the same time, you're saying you're being hacked?
Well, it's almost like there's a ghost in the machine. And the ghost is obviously not very happy with the content of that video, which was talking about something that most Australians don't know of, and that is the deadliest medical scandal in Australia's history. And so, you know, when people ask themselves, why is it that they've never heard of Australia's deadliest medical scandal, contaminated blood? Well, there's a lot of reasons why you haven't heard about it. And one of them is things like that, where you try and talk to people about it and things just disappear.
You've got some good news today, mate, and this is why you're on. So you should be able to see this article you've sent me. It's NHS contaminated blood scandal, victims to be compensated by government. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, well, I think earlier we were just saying that I've been, in one way or another, fighting this since I was a kid, since 1988. And in terms of the global contaminated blood scandal, this is the biggest news ever. The news that the United Kingdom, that the British government has accepted liability. After 40 years, they've accepted liability for the UK's or the National Health Service's deadliest treatment scandal, contaminated blood. And the reason why it's just such a massive issue for us in Australia is it was actually the British that basically implemented their protocols and their blood policies here in Australia. So they're the architect of so much that went wrong in the global contaminated blood scandal. So now that the British government have stopped, holding out, and now that they've stopped defending the indefensible, they've finally admitted liability. It puts their partners in crime, the Australian government, in a very, very dubious position, really it does. I mean, it's a bit like what's happening right now is a bit like when, the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall comes down and you've got, Ceausescu and Romania, dictatorships in the Eastern Bloc trying to, keep on being communist states when the big brother, the big Soviet Union and communism has just fallen. Well, in Australia, what we've got is we've got CSL, who's Australia's biggest blood products provider and the world's biggest blood products provider. You've got the Australian Red Cross, who manage our blood supply, who for the last 40 years have been saying that everything they did all these thousands of infections that happened due to the blood supply were the result of an unavoidable contamination. There was nothing they could do. And now we know that that was a total lie, and they've been exposed as liars, as the British government admit liability, and they admit in many cases that they knew that the blood that they were distributing to patients was contaminated.
Wow, this is gonna get some people very very upset, and the other side of things, people are going to get very excited, because we all do have a lot of worries about CSL, and obviously CSL is going to be making our AstraZeneca vaccine, as we know.
Yes.
So,
yep.
What are the implications that you can see that's going to happen down here? Obviously, this will tie into Greg Hunt's history of CSL and the Red Cross.
I think the implications are the biggest implications we've ever had in terms of what this will mean for healthcare in Australia. We've got, there are a number of very, very serious issues, and I'll explain what they are. We, of course, recently had a Royal Commission into the responses of the churches and institutions to the child sex abuse scandal. Child sex abuse, of course, campaigners have been wanting a Royal Commission into that for an age, for decades, and they bravely fought for many, many years. And some lost their lives in that brave fight to depression and suicide and all of the terrible things that can happen as a consequence of child sex abuse or being a victim of it. And what happened was that collectively as a nation in Australia, we have this thing where we might disagree on a bunch of things. We might disagree on what football team to support and all that kind of stuff, or what's the best Sunday night dinner. But we all collectively agree that we don't do child abuse in this country, and we certainly do not support bureaucrats or politicians that cover up child abuse. I predict the worst of times for Australia's Health Minister, Greg Hunt. He has essentially staked his entire career on the line that children with haemophilia, we of course lost 1,400 Australians with the inherited blood disorder haemophilia.
Yep.
And yeah, I could hear you. You right?
Yeah, all good. Continue. Yeah.
Yeah, and we lost 1,400 Australians to the 1,400 Australian haemophiliacs. We lost them to tainted blood. And what's happened is that Greg Hunt set his stall out in saying that everything that happened happened with best science advice. Well, of course, he's in desperate trouble now because the evidence is out. We've got the documents, and that was a terrible lie. That same sort of logic would say that priests knowingly abusing children happened with the blessings of the Christian faith, and that's just not true. And we think that Greg Hunt's days are numbered as health minister. We also think that there will have to be a criminal investigation.
Wow. How far back does Hunt's relationship with CSL go? Because I know we all probably know of Jane Halton, which we'll get into shortly. And I'm sure you've got some words to say about her. And I know, she was obviously part of that, I think it was 2003 inquiry, and, allegedly covered up, so I've seen some very dubious comments from Greg Hunt regarding CSL, which I'll play one to you in a minute and I'll get your feedback on it. But how far does Greg go back with CSL? Well,
Greg Hunt is Australia's health minister, and he's been the health minister, forgive me if I'm wrong, it's been, I think, about 4 very long years under Greg Hunt. And we had his predecessor, Susan Ley, who similarly did nothing. No health minister will ever do anything about CSL, okay? How far back does his relationship go? Well, the real question here is how far back does the relationship with the health department go with CSL?
Right.
Well, it goes back forever, because the real truth here is that CSL is the Australian government. CSL is a privatised company, right? So people say, what do you mean?
Sorry to cut you off. So it's almost like one of these companies that they privatise, but behind the scenes, it's like a de facto government-run company. Is that sort of...
Yeah. That's right. And if you look at it, what happens is there's a favouritism to CSL. And that favouritism means that if you look at their history, and if you go to infectedbloodaustralia.com, there's quite a bit there about CSL, and you can see things that we've put up about their history. CSL have been caught out in breach after breach after breach that's put Australian lives at risk and even killed Australians. And every time they're indemnified. And the horrifying part is that we've all heard of indemnities for vaccine makers before they make a vaccine. The unique thing about the Australian government's relationship with CSL is they indemnify CSL after they get it wrong, not before, but afterward. For example, when CSL did terrible things to haemophilia children in the 1980s, killing 1,400 of them,
yes,
they were indemnified after they did it, not before they did it, but afterwards. So the relationship goes back right from when CSL was a government-owned agency up until 1994, and the story of favouritism, the indemnities, the refusal to investigate, the refusal to properly investigate the deaths of children, all sorts of mixing in of foreign blood into CSL's products and then relabelling them as 100% Australian blood, again and again, offence after offence. And Greg Hunt is the first one to defend them, like every other health minister has been about CSL.
Well, have a look at this video and I'll get your thoughts on this. This one blows my mind. Okay, let's just, hopefully this plays okay here. Let's see how we go.
I do look around and I see a lot of very dangerous men and women. People who have imagined the future and brought it to being. And that is the story of CSL, and that's the story of so many extraordinary people in this room tonight. Dr. Brian McNamee, and Brian took a small arm of government. If you'd followed Brian's lead, you'd be doing very well. But his is an amazing story, and he is arguably Australia's greatest ever entrepreneur CEO. You have, yeah.
Okay, that's enough. Who gets on stage and who says dangerous people?
Well, they often like to, with these sorts of characters, they often like to tell you what they're doing before they do it, or it's sort of like a kink, if you will. And the thing is, what I ask people listening today or watching today is,
yep,
have a think about it. He's at this gala dinner, 100 years of this incredible company, CSL, and he's never once investigated. He's the Health Minister of Australia, and he's never once, not even once, investigated the deaths of 1,400 of CSL's core customers, many of them children with the blood clotting disorder haemophilia. So he's a health minister that's never once investigated 1,400 deaths. Now, Australia, we've got a decent population. What are we, 25 million odd now?
Yes.
But we're not United States level. I mean, we're not hundreds of millions, right? So when you have a treatment for something like haemophilia, which, by the way, was not life-threatening in many cases. These people weren't going to bleed to death. There were patients given it for bruising, for goodness sake, friends of mine who were infected as children. And these friends, they lost their lives as children and their parents buried them as children. And 1,400 dead, and there's no investigation from Australia's health minister, but what there is a performance at a CSL gala night where he mocks and jokes and says this is a very dangerous company. And he talks about one of the people that presided over that company, the chair of CSL, being perhaps Australia's greatest entrepreneur. Well,
Now,
I'm sorry.
That's Dr. Brian McNamee. I did just put a slide up there.
Right. Well, yeah, it is. And I just want to say something about that. Australia punches above its weight when it comes to entrepreneurs. We've had some very, very colourful ones. We've had some flamboyant ones. You know, I remember as a kid seeing an airship fly overhead and it had Bond on the side of it. Not James
What?
Bond.
Sorry, say that again.
I remember as a kid,
Yeah.
in Sydney, one day I heard an airship, an air balloon, you know, those great big things like the Hindenburg.
Sure.
But this wasn't going to blow up. And it's flying low overhead, and over the side it had Bond, B-O-N-D. And I thought, is that James Bond? Is that the next James Bond movie or something? No, it was Alan Bond.
Right.
A very flamboyant, colourful Australian entrepreneur. Then you've got Kerry Packers, and you've got a whole list of John Elliott, the beer magnate. And we've got all of these. Yep. Yeah, we've got all of these Australian entrepreneurs, but yet Greg Hunt stands on stage and says that Australia's greatest ever entrepreneur is a former public servant who's listed as making more money from the float of a public asset than anybody else before in Australian history. He's a guy that's never, ever answered questions about the 1,400 mainly children that were killed by this treatment, that in many cases they didn't need to survive. They were indemnified after the fact. They never did a recall. They never told any of those users of that contaminated product that they should go in and get tested and seek treatment. And a guy who presides over a fucking fiasco like that is Australia's greatest entrepreneur. Excuse my French, but...
So that slide here, which obviously it says, the whole strategy from Dr. Brian McNamee, the whole strategy is to keep us hidden to some degree, that we provide a service to the government, the Australian Red Cross, because there is a concern that the voluntary donor system would be troubled, that a greedy commercial fractionator was seen to be profiting from their donation. So in essence, we stay right below the radar in Australia. It is not a positive. So my dad, for instance, right, he's one of these guys who won't dig into anything. If it's on the TV, it's probably true. Now, he would be the first to go. He would give blood probably, I don't know how many times he can a year, but it would be at the maximum amount of times. He donates to every bloody Oxfam, and hasn't got 2 cents to rub together. How many Australians know that we've probably seen, and you tell me if I'm wrong, has there been times where we've got messages coming across in the Australian media where they said, we're running low on Australia's blood, we need blood, and then it's getting sold? Is that what I'm understanding, or what?
Yeah. This is a very interesting thing. And first of all, I'd like to say what a great Australian your father sounds to be. And, it's so typical, isn't it? The fact that he hasn't got 2 cents to rub together, you're saying, and yet when he does have anything, he gives to charity or donates blood. I think blood donors are real heroes, and I encourage people to continue donating blood. Now, when we hear over the years, an announcement, the Red Cross is running low on blood, it very often is actually true. It could be for a particular blood group or blood type that they're low on. Yeah. Okay. But you see, sometimes it's actually used for propaganda. Let me explain. Years ago, when we were campaigning about contaminated blood, 2 decades ago, when we would have a crack in the press about the Red Cross, you could be sure that a day or two later, you'd suddenly hear an announcement that we're low on blood. Now, it's very effective propaganda for the Red Cross because they have an agreement with the media where the media will actually do that for free because it's considered to be a public service message. So whenever the Red Cross felt like we were getting a bit close to them, and it felt a bit nervous, they just put out one of their propaganda pieces. Was it true? We felt the timing was cynical. But the point remains, you're saying is, so are they actually saying we've got shortages and yet behind the scenes they're selling blood? And the answer is yeah, they are. What happens is that CSL, this is what people don't know, CSL is one of Australia's largest companies. We don't know, we haven't heard of them. What do? What is a fractionator? Well, what Brian McNamee, the chair of CSL, was admitting there was that he runs a company that has this blood plasma fractionation warehouse, laboratory, factory in Melbourne, okay? What it does is it takes in loads and loads and loads, tons and tons and tons of litres, thousands of litres of plasma, the yellow substance that's in our blood that you separate it. You have this yellow substance, blood plasma. Right. And they put it in these great big vats, and CSL do all sorts of things. They treat it, they make it into a world of different products. These are products that could end up being used by burns victims, could end up being used by pregnant women, could end up being used by, in the old days, in the 1980s and the 1990s, which is the period that centres around contaminated blood, they used blood plasma to make products for haemophiliacs, such as the blood product Factor VIII, which killed 1,400 Australians. Yep. So a lot of people are donating blood thinking, right, well, my blood's going to end up going directly to a person that's been in a car accident or, say, someone with cancer. And yes, often that could be the case, but on many occasions it's also gone into commercial products which have been moved around the world by this company CSL. And it's a very, very interesting thing because in the 1980s, the blood system here in Australia was very poorly regulated indeed. And later on, if we've got time, I might tell you about how one of the biggest aspects of the global contaminated blood scandal was the role of blood brokers or blood dealers. And in the 1980s, CSL were guilty of allowing these blood brokers and blood dealers to ship product, to move Australian donated blood right throughout the world for cash.
Wow. So are you still there? I didn't lose you, did I?
Yeah. Yeah, we're here, yeah.
So you can see that on your screen now where it says in December, this is back to the article there. In December, the inquiry heard that some haemophiliac patients weren't told they were HIV positive until more than 2 years after receiving infected blood products. So I'll get you to expand on that. But just a quick thought that come to my mind is, obviously a lot of people have come to you because we're all worried about the vaccine and we're worried about CSL, and that's where you have popped up, probably on a lot of people's radar. And I'll give Matt Lawson credit, which I normally don't, for putting him on your show. And that's when I used to follow him, and good on him for doing that. So good on you, Matt.
Yep.
And that's where I'll leave it with Lawson. But what AstraZeneca said, and I should have had the quote here, but off the top of my head, it was clearly, as a business, we can't afford to offer any liability or to have any liability, because what happens in 4 years down the track is we don't know of the side effects. Now, CSL's making that product for AstraZeneca. You've got the head of AstraZeneca saying in 4 years, we just can't be liable because it's not a good business decision. Now, people might look back at this CSL blood thing and go, well, it was 20 years, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. No. And look at this. Look, what's your thoughts on that? And just on that comment there with this article, how it's going to open up a whole bunch of litigation.
Yeah. Those people that say this is 20, 30 years ago don't understand CSL. The first thing that you need to understand, and they really don't, okay, and I'll explain very simply for those individuals so that they do quickly. One of the most dangerous things you can ever have is have a company that's in the business of making products like vaccines, who does not observe the central tenet of Australian law that protects us, and that is duty of candor. So what happens is that it's a bit like the stock exchange. If we've got a share or stock on the exchange and we know that there's something, maybe the product that we've got or the company that we have is in major trouble, and some of the things that we thought we could potentially do profit-wise with our company, we can't. And in fact, the company might fold. We've got to actually declare that to the stock exchange, okay?
Yep.
And so when CSL have a dodgy product and it's killing kids and what have you, and they keep distributing it knowingly to children, that's a breach of their duty of candor. So when people say, well, this is 20 or 30 years ago, what I say to them now is, well, if that's the case, why does CSL breach their duty of candor over contaminated blood every day, every week and every month for 30 years, right?
Yes.
Because, to give you an example, again, I like to give you analogies because people just don't understand what CSL is. They give them a free pass every time. But they shouldn't get a free pass anymore, right? So especially now that we've got millions of Australians being lined up to be injected by this company. So let's give an example. Let's just say, now I haven't flown Aeroflot, the Russian airline, ever, okay? And perhaps there's some prejudice over that, and I apologise to any, Russian aviation enthusiasts, but ahead of time. But what it's got to do with is that when I was a kid, I listened to the news, and it seemed like every time there was a plane crash somewhere in the world, you'd hear the name Aeroflot. And so I sort of got a bit like Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman in that movie. Yeah, I sort of had this thing of going, okay, well, I'll make sure not to fly Aeroflot. Now, let's just say that Aeroflot have had, CSL, they've killed they've killed several thousand people. So let's just say that 15 Aeroflot 747s crash every week, for several months. And what happens is they offer no black box for any of the aircraft. There are no answers. There's no help. There's no nothing. They don't even send flowers to the people's funerals.
No
and then people are saying to me that I should get on board an Aeroflot flight and do so with confidence, or actually be forced to get on. I mean, they actually forced me on, and they'll tell me if I don't get on the Aeroflot flight, I won't be able to work, I won't be able to travel, I won't be able to see my loved ones in nursing, in aged care. I'd be very upset, especially when that airline won't answer questions about what it did with all the other people it killed in their crashes. So when people are saying about CSL, oh, well, you know, they're guilty of the deadliest medical scandal in Australian history and it's only 20 years ago, well, they haven't answered questions about it in that 20 years. And now we're asking parents to inject their children with more CSL product? I'm sorry, but no.
Wow. So what's it been now? It's been over 20 years, right? So I believe you were telling me, well, actually, before I do that, have a look at this video now, and then I'll get your comments on this one, because this is definitely a public enemy #1 for me.
Australia currently have the manufacturing capacity to produce all of the quantities of vaccine that we would need.
See, sorry, I'm not sure you're even seeing that, are you? So we'll start.
I've got your logo there.
Yeah, that's right. So
good logo, love it.
You should have recognised the voice though. Here we go.
It may be here.
Yeah, there. Here we go.
Australia currently have the manufacturing capacity to produce all of the quantities of vaccine that we would need.
Australia is one of a very small number of countries globally, probably a bit more than 20, but about 20, who can actually produce vaccines domestically. And so we are unbelievably lucky. And I think every Australian's probably heard of CSL. They have a great vaccine business. They produce lots and lots of flu vaccine, and they were the ones who produced vaccine for us during swine flu, which most of us would remember.
How did that go?
So they do have capacity. Now, they can't produce every possible kind of vaccine, but in terms of the Astro vaccine, but also the University of Queensland vaccine, they certainly, I believe, would have that capacity. So we are actually very lucky in Australia.
So let's say we get the patent for this.
That's enough. Yeah. Now, Jane Halton.
Yes.
What's her history with CSL and the infected blood saga?
Well, she's a key architect of the most devastating cover-up in our nation's history. This is Jane Halton, who ran the Commonwealth Health Department, the most senior bureaucrat that did so. And in the early 2000s, 2003, 2004, we had a Senate inquiry into the hepatitis C outbreak in our blood supply that infected tens of thousands of Australians. These were hospital patients, accident victims, anyone who received a blood transfusion, elective surgery patients even. It wasn't isolated to the acutely ill who would have died without a transfusion. It was just anybody that received a blood supply, tens of thousands of Australians. And so we had this Senate inquiry, and the Commonwealth Health Department, their behaviour was utterly criminal at that inquiry, utterly criminal. And also, it's our belief that Jane Halton and CSL colluded during that inquiry in what their defence would be over this knowing distribution of contaminated blood and various other things. And it was then that Jane Halton and CSL began this strategy of lying under oath. Halton wasn't a witness to herself, but of course she set the strategy given her position. And when it came to the evidence that Australia needed to hear, which was, how did this happen? How did tens of thousands of Australians become infected with a deadly virus like hepatitis C from the blood supply? And how did 1,750 Australians with haemophilia become infectious with a virus like hepatitis C from CSL products? Well, we knew the reason that it happened was because of the sweetheart deal between Jane Halton and CSL and the Australian government and CSL, which is CSL are green lit. And what that means is they're green lit to do what they want. And what they wanted to do in the 1980s was they were producing this blood product for haemophiliacs, which was a very big money earner for them. And in fact, it's what made CSL the $100+ billion company they are today, right? And before 1980, they'd never had this kind of loot, this kind of money, but they'd never delved in a product like this before. And so what they did was this Factor VIII product involves a lot of requirements for blood donations, okay? It's a mass pooled blood product. And so CSL, what they did was they told everyone in Australia, listen, guys, we've got this amazing product called Factor 8, and you're very lucky. Aren't you lucky to have CSL? That's what they always tell you. They always tell you how lucky you are to have CSL, right? And CSL said, listen, guys, we're self-sufficient. We only use Australian donated blood because it's safer. And all the while, what they were doing was actually importing blood from third world impoverished nations. We're very, very desperately poor and very unhealthy people in some cases, unfortunately, were being drained of blood, being milked. And CSL will get them milked, and they go into these really poor places in Papua New Guinea, they go to Indonesia, go to Malaysia, anywhere where they could, take advantage of people. And then they'd ship, then the blood comes to Australia, and then they'd mix it into the Australian blood supply, right? And then they'd rebadge it. They'd empty the sachets from all around the world. And the trouble is, when you're collecting blood in the 1980s from Malaysia and Indonesia, CSL's own records say that, look, they know that it's basically that deadly viruses are endemic in those populations, in those donor pools. And they said, look, just put it into the Australian blood supply. So they did. And then what they did was they rebadged it all, okay, and redistributed it as Australian. So it's fake goods. You wouldn't be allowed to do that on Amazon, for instance. Well, they were doing that with our health and then charging the Australian taxpayer for it. So that Senate inquiry in 2004, the one that Jane Halton is managing the government's response and working with CSL under oath, and I think you've got that, under oath, I had said, look, CSL mixed blood, and that's why we had the terrible deaths in the haemophilia community in Australia. That's why so many, I think it was 100% of people that use CSL blood product, I'm not exaggerating, by the way, this is a fact, 100% of people who use CSL distributed blood products in the 1980s and 90s became infectious with either HIV or hepatitis C because they mixed blood. Well, of course, Jane Halton's friends at CSL, they go under oath and they completely deny that ever happened. They said, no, and I think I've got it there. They basically said, no, we never mixed blood. We never did that. We occasionally mix blood with people from New Zealand into our blood supply, but there are very similar donor selection processes for both countries, so it's not a problem. Well, because of that lie, the Senate decided that haemophiliacs should not be helped because they said that according to CSL's advice and, I guess Jane Halton's influence, the best science advice was involved. And Australia was the only country to have an inquiry into a contaminated blood scandal and find that everything was done perfectly and that CSL and others should actually get a pat on the back. And so haemophiliacs were denied help by that inquiry, corruptly so, and unfortunately we've lost most of our members since.
Oh my God. Well, it wouldn't be the first time that she's been involved in an alleged cover-up, I tell you now.
First time, but this is the one we're actually saying to Australia, what are we going to do about this though? I mean, me personally, I can deal with a lot of nonsense from politicians, okay? I'm thick-skinned in that way.
Sure.
I draw the line with child harm. I have to draw a line at that, okay? Because a lot of these patients with haemophilia were children. And what happened was when this new product Factor 8 came around, that CSL so heavily marketed, you had people that had this haemophilia gene, they had the potential to have children with haemophilia who were deciding to have children because they're told, we're in this golden new age thanks to CSL and so on, and life is just so good. And, with those parents have rushed to take CSL product if they've been told the truth, that they were mixing in blood from people, impoverished people in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea, and taking in blood that they knew to be infectious and then rebadging it, relabeling it as Australian blood. I mean, what parent would do that to their kid? You see, so this is why with Jane Halton, I've got to say to people, guys, there's millions of us being lined up to be injected by Jane Halton's schemes. But how trustworthy is this person? Look at her track record, right? Are you going to make that decision for your family based on Jane Halton or based on CSL? Please don't.
Well, she seems to be the go-to get-out-of-trouble woman in Australia. I tell you, because...
Well, she wasn't the go-to get-out-of-trouble woman for haemophiliacs, let me tell you, because they lost...
for the government,
Yeah, for the guys that pull the trigger, yeah.
That's right. I mean, the silence from the media just blows my mind with this one because, okay, we all know about Event 201, but let's go back a bit, go back a bit earlier with Jane and, Where do you start? We can start with the Children Overboard affair. Okay. Now, she was lying on that, and that came out that she was lying. Nothing happened. But the only people who really reported that on was Crikey. And they're the same ones the only ones I've seen anywhere in the mainstream media. Well, they're not mainstream, but nowhere else has anyone even mentioned that she did the Crown Casino. She headed the inquiry, but how does this happen when she's on the board of Crown Casino? But yet she's in the hotel inquiry where they own a bunch of the hotels, right? But she essentially 2 in Victoria alone. Hang on. Now, no wonder that was an absolute whitewash. An absolute... And then, listen, I've got to go visit my mum. My mum's in an old age home, right? But I couldn't go visit her unless I get the flu shot. Now, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I'm pro-choice, and you can argue all day if you want the flu shot or not, but it should be my decision. But for me to go see my mother, I had to get a flu shot. Now, that was implemented by CODA, which is Coalition of the Aging, one of Jane's 1000's positions, Okay, so she set that up. So, okay, sure, we won't mandatory the vaccine, but this is how I feel it's going to happen in here. They might not say they'll make it mandatory for my mum, but I won't be able to visit her. Because if they're going to do that with flu shot, sure as hell they're going to do that with this bloody...
I've got news for you. I've got terrible news for people listening there. So, I mean, I don't want to... When I say terrible news, that I'm going to give people the truth, but I'm also going to give them positive truth as well.
Yes.
We're in the fight of our lives, okay? Not just us contaminated blood victims, but all Australians. And I'll explain why. It's quite clear that what's happening doesn't involve us, okay? And that they don't have our best interests. And so I ask you this, are you happy to be lined up by people that really need to be criminally investigated in relation to the knowing distribution of contaminated blood to children? We don't do child harm in Australia. We have to set a standard. And what we've got is we've got these senior bureaucrats who are very, have a loose values, shall we say, or a loose handle on the truth. And I think in these circumstances where we're asking families to be lined up in their millions, I think we're going to have to reclaim integrity of government because I actually am very worried going forward about all of this.
Well, we do have good news though. Like, obviously they've made millions, but how much could this new lawsuit in the UK? Could this be, as you said, this Berlin Wall? This could be.
It's the beginning of the end.
Yeah,
it's the beginning of the end. What they'll do.
Good news. Yeah.
Yeah, great news. It's great news for anyone that believes in integrity and health, because when you have people that harm kids and when you have people that lie and cheat and steal and kill, they might be good as Viking raiders or something in the Middle Ages, or I don't know. But what place do we have in society today? I don't see them as value. I think we're moving to a new, more positive era, and what it will take is us just saying no. I think it was the wartime leader Winston Churchill who said that the hardest word in the English language to say is no. Well, of course, he said no to Adolf Hitler. And I think maybe one or two of us could start saying no to Jane Halton because I don't see anything in this person, particularly with the experience of contaminated blood victims, that tells us that she's trustworthy, let alone to be in charge of anything to do with our health.
Absolutely. I just don't know why she can get such a great free pass. This all wins if we get the media on our side, and obviously that's...
Well, when we say get the media on side, we also have to ask the question of what is the media? I mean, you do understand that the main sort of people that are profiting from vaccines actually own large swathes of the media.
Yeah, and stakeholder now. Because obviously I mentioned the media, and I don't think we'd be in a situation right now if ABC didn't play their part, which goes back into the AIDS and the, you remember the old AIDS videos of the Grim Reaper? Maybe you can touch on that for a minute.
So, okay, well, actually everything with this whole thing, Jane Halton, with CSL, the makers of the AstraZeneca vaccine and all of it, and contaminated blood, all feeds into each other.
Yeah.
And how, okay, well, I'll tell you how. So contaminated blood is big news now in the United Kingdom. And the BBC in the last few years have been covering and investigating their nation's deadliest medical scandal, which also has links to ours here. The British actually created the policies and the protocols that led to contaminated blood in Australia. Now, isn't it interesting that in other Commonwealth countries like Canada, other victims of this global contaminated scandal, the Canadian public broadcaster did investigations and reports of their scandal in the 1980s and 90s, and they had their equivalent of a Royal Commission. And the Irish, well, they had lots of media coverage, and they made a mini-series starring Brenda Fricker, the Oscar winner. I think she was in My Left Foot. And they had a legal inquiry and huge help for victims. Then you had an inquiry in Scotland, and they had massive response for victims. And now you have the UK's largest ever legal inquiry, which already has heard that the government, obviously in view of the criminal evidence that is just leaking out of everywhere, has decided to finally accept liability. But the incredible thing is that the ABC has never once, unlike Canada, Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, United States, all these countries that have been through contaminated blood, their public broadcasters have investigated and done something about it, but not Australia. Not Australia. Why? Well, we victims have written to them countless times over many years. We've begged, we've had dying people write them urgent letters begging, please. And the ABC on a couple of times have wavered, because not everyone there is heartless. There's some great journalists at the ABC. I know some of them, and they're good people. But what happens is they were going to investigate, they were going to look at it, but then at the last minute it got vetoed. And I'll give you an example. Last year we had a wonderful, really brave, excellent member of our group, a haemophiliac, and he had been diagnosed with bowel and liver cancer, and we were very concerned. We wanted acknowledgement because he was a victim of a CSL product. We wanted acknowledgement for him and his family. And so we began talking to the ABC, and they said, well, yeah, we might have him on 7:30 report. Well, we were looking forward to hearing his account on the 7:30 report. And the next thing you know, he was dumped, and he wasn't going to be on the 7:30 report. But you know who was on instead, to our horror?
No.
Jane Halton.
That tells you who's in them. That tells you straight away.
Video where she was gushing in her praise of CSL. You know, that very rehearsed. I'm sure everybody's heard of CSL.
Oh,
it's incredible.
She does that.
Right?
Yes.
Everybody's heard of CSL with the coloured glasses and the performance. And we're there sitting and thinking, oh, hold on here. The ABC were talking to a victim of CSL, and they dump him. He's got cancer. And the next thing you know, we've got Jane Halton gushing in her praise of CSL. So we complained. We've complained numerous times. We've written to the Gavin Morris, the boss. We recently had, to give an example, one of our victims, our members, a lovely lady. She's in very challenging set of health circumstances because of her infection from a contaminated blood transfusion. And she contacted the head of the ABC, and he said, oh, we've got marvellous medical reporters. I'll put you in touch with them. So they put her in touch with them, and guess what? Just ignored. And then she writes back, and again, just ignored. It is contemptuous. And in 40 years, the ABC has never once investigated our nation's deadliest medical scandal. They haven't done what public broadcasters have done in Canada. They haven't done what they've done in Ireland, England, or anywhere. And in fact, the BBC, when they had their equivalent of Four Corners, which is called the Panorama Program, they investigated. Anyone listening to this can just go onto Google, have a look at BBC Panorama, Contaminated Blood, The Search for the Truth. That ran in 2017, and shortly afterwards, England called its largest ever legal inquiry. So the ABC are steadfastly against ever looking at or investigating contaminated blood. Why could that be? Well, there's lots of speculation, and some of it is because one of the Labour health ministers who basically started the process of, or facilitated the talk of CSL being privatised, was former Australian Labour health minister Neil Blewett. Well, Neil Blewett emulated all of the steps that the baddies in the UK contaminated blood cover-up, like their health ministers were doing in the 80s. He denied help to haemophiliacs, just like they did in England. He refused an investigation in the 1980s, just like they did in England. But he was championed as giving one of the world's best responses to the crisis. That's the great irony. The best responses to the AIDS crisis. And he made Ita Buttrose the face of Australia's AIDS campaign. Now, people might remember those infamous television commercials with the Grim Reaper bowling a bowling ball, and you've got these defenceless families being mowed down by this Grim Reaper and the AIDS threat, which scared the daylights out of us, didn't it? Well, Ita Buttrose,
clearly.
Yeah, Ita Buttrose was the face of that campaign. She made the decision on the Grim Reaper. Neil Blewett was part of that decision as well. And they've both been heralded as the great champions of Australia's response, this world-beating response to the AIDS problem of the 1980s. But you see, the thing is, that's a load of bullshit. They might be champions. I'm not discounting that. There may be people with HIV/AIDS who felt very helped by the bowling ball commercial or by having Ita Buttrose front the AIDS campaign. But it's been a disaster for victims of Australia's deadliest medical scandal, haemophiliacs, because perhaps it's the fact that Ita Buttrose doesn't want the narrative changed. She's the chair of the ABC, and quite frankly, she'd die in a ditch before she'd ever allow anyone that survived CSL products or the contaminated blood scandal to get a hearing on the ABC. If they were English, they'd get up on the BBC, but because they're Australians and victims of Australia's largest company, they can't get up on a public broadcaster. I mean, crikey, you've heard of corruption in communist countries where a state-owned network might not run something that's anti the government. But how many times have you heard about a state-owned network that won't run a medical scandal because it might offend a large private company? I mean, it's just outrageous.
Well, between you and me, I know what's going to be coming after this. There's some more information that hasn't been released, and I tell you what, Ita Buttrose, you better worry, mate. And that's all I'm going to say at this stage.
Well, Ita, I like Ita. I think she's a bunny, sunny person, and we've got no issues.
Look, she's doing her job, I'm sure. Maybe she's not even aware. I don't know. I've worked with her in live entertainment before, and she was nice to me. That's all I can say.
Paul Hogan, great Aussie icon. Right. Loved him as Crocodile Dundee when I saw it 50 years ago. Yeah. Ita Buttrose, loved her when she was an editor of women's magazines. But we're now in the serious business of Australia facing the most devastating set of circumstances, and we've got millions of Australians being lined up for a vaccine, in many cases that some don't even want or feel that they should have to have in order to live. And we can't get really pertinent and salient information about one of the manufacturers of these vaccines onto the ABC to share with other Australians, that we say, are things like duty of candour important? Should we know? I'm going to give you an example. If you want to go with the ABC's mentality, should we know who's flying our planes? Should pilots even have licenses? Oh, you know what? Ida's probably got a friendship with the guy that runs Qantas. Forget his name. Irish guy, right? She's probably at a few champagne cocktail parties with him, going around the world flying first class. What happens if Qantas get in a few plane crashes? Is Ida and the ABC not going to run that because she doesn't want to offend a great Aussie icon? It's just ridiculous. We've got to get our country back. And how we get it back is, look, as I say, Paul Hogan's great, Ita Buttrose are great, but we've got to get people who are sober and able to steer the ship.
Now,
without
this is my call out. I mean, this is what we need, and this is what's so great about you is we need more people. We know what happened. I don't know if you know much about what happened to those 500 doctors that popped up on Sky News that time. Like, was that real? Where are they? That was a thing where it was like, okay, maybe they were just against the lockdown. But, or is it just because the protest movement has become a parody of itself, of just stupid characters, and that they don't want to have anything to do with it? Like, it's time now to get serious. Let's step away from insane conspiracy theories, and God knows, I'm fringe with my ideas, but some of these things that have been put out there lately is absolutely ridiculous. And it's time we just get legit people out there, because I can tell you now, on my page, I see a lot of doctors interact from people all across the world.
That is very positive. And actually, it's very interesting you brought that up, because it's saying, about these doctors, the 100 doctors talking about the lockdown. Where have they gone? Why are they not speaking up more? Perhaps, they face retribution. Who knows? But to give an example, tainted blood, we still don't know how many people have been traced. There are potentially, this is the real truth right now, there are potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of Australians out there who have hepatitis C as a result of blood transfusion or infusion that don't know it. Okay, and I really have to make this point. Hepatitis C is a leading cause of liver cancer in Australia, and in many cases it's asymptomatic. What that means is that people can walk around for years and not feel anything like what they might think is a symptom of hepatitis, like you'd have, say, something like an outbreak of hepatitis A, okay, where you'd clearly be pretty sick for a while. So there's people with what might be, say, a sort of ticking time bomb, okay?
Yes.
And they don't know. They still don't know. We haven't had a recall of blood for the problem years of the mid-90s and before. The ABC refuses to talk about this issue, so people don't know. And so this is the real scary thing, is that I think it's fantastic that Ida Buttrose as the face of the AIDS campaign. I think it's fantastic that her and Neil Blewett slap each other on the back and think they're marvellous. It's great for their egos. But how is that helping people around Australia now who are at risk to contaminated blood or are infected and don't know it? We've got to get...
That's the great fear of many people now, is that what's going to happen in 10 years from now, and we've realised that an untested mRNA vaccine. I mean, what's your thoughts, Charles, on the demonisation of AstraZeneca, but nothing about Pfizer? Do you think there was anything to that, or I put out there that maybe that AstraZeneca is a different type of vaccine opposed to truer mRNA. But I did read an article the other day that AstraZeneca and CSL said we can adapt. We can adapt and make changes as needed. So maybe it might be a little bit closer.
CSL will make whatever changes they need to make to regain control. There's no doubt about that. Now, what do I have to think about these different vaccinations? Well, do you know, for many years with contaminated blood, we were approached by people that might be described as anti-vaxxers, okay?
Yes.
And they want to know what our view is on vaccines. Well, actually, do you know, our view on health is that safety must be of paramount importance all of the time. So I'm about safety, right? Even when I drive my car, I drive it like a 93-year-old, apparently. I'm pretty slow. I'm so slow I might even be dangerous, okay? Yes. But my view on it is, okay, so we've got reports on the AstraZeneca vaccine. We've got reports of this blood clotting issue. I heard last night, although I've got to confirm it, a thing called plastic bubble syndrome. Now, this is pretty interesting to me because I think they're talking about the boy in the bubble.
Oh, it sounded like me growing up a little bit.
Well, guess what? That's my disease.
Yeah.
I had severe aplastic anemia, and as a result, no immune system. My bone marrow failed.
Then so how do you keep yourself healthy? I mean, what's your secret? What's your secret to keeping healthy? Because obviously you have an immune deficiency, I'd imagine.
Massive. I've got AIDS levels sort of pathetic, impinged upon the immune system.
Yep.
What's my secret? Well, you got to remember, for many, many years I lived in isolation. Not now, but I've been under a COVID-19 lockdown most of my life. And what happened was, when I was a kid, I didn't see people for long periods. I used to talk on the phone. That was it. And what happened was, back then they thought that anybody who had a flu would kill me, or a cold. If I pick up anything, I'm dead. But what happened was, for many, many years, I got flus and colds anyway, no matter what I did. And I spent many, many years just sick all of the time. And my quality of life was not very good. And my brother, years and years ago, said, why don't you try garlic? He said, go on, garlic, like the Eastern Europeans have said for years. You know, Russians, they make scary aeroplanes, aeroflot, but they've got some good health ideas. All right, yeah, Russians. I like Russian ideas. So I thought, okay, and the Russians eat lots of garlic. So I thought, okay, I'll get the garlic into me. So I took this idea that I'd eat lots and lots of garlic. So yeah, I'm not very popular with vampires, but I ate lots of garlic, and then I thought, okay, well, I'll take any sign of a flu or cold. I'll actually swallow lots of garlic tablets. So I did that, and I thought, well, what if I do that with things like vitamins? Because vitamins are in us, you know, they're not foreign to our bodies. Our bodies know what to do with them, right? They really do. And so I thought, okay, well, if I ever feel like a sickness is approaching, I'll put lots of vitamin C down me. I'll put lots of garlic down me. And then as the years went on, I read more about, say, things like orthomolecular medicine, the idea that we could use nutrients to, you know, fight health conditions. And I started using vitamin D. And then this is before we found out that vitamin D is, in a way, many times more effective than a flu vaccine in preventing things like flu. I think there was a study done in Japan years ago about how good old sunshine, vitamin D, was like 8 times more effective than the flu vaccine at preventing flu. So by taking in this information and realising, you know what, I don't have to just be a passive patient here, just copying every virus and waiting for the government to hit me with another vaccine, or waiting for Jane Halton to tell me how marvellous some commercial company are at keeping me alive. What I did was I actually realised, wow, I don't have to get sick with certain things. If I have this idea that rather than just sitting there and waiting, I can be proactive. I can be taking garlic. I can be taking, you know, 5,000 IU of vitamin D today without worrying about getting blood tests or the need for it. And that's what I learned to do, was to learn to nourish my own immune system.
And you know what? You know what makes my blood boil? Is that throughout that whole time when we watched the news, and all we were combated with was this animation of the COVID thing behind them, right? Obviously a fear campaign, we know that. But nothing about supplementation when we know Australians are low in vitamin D in a way, right? But to be stuck inside, and it's like the whole time, and Melissa Harrison's book really just shown how Australia has been streamlined for no other solution but this vaccine, you know, and obviously it's tied into the goals of the World Economic Forum and, the work of Alison McDowell's work, where we're heading towards a blockchain future and hedge funds and, the biometric surveillance state. And so it's obviously a lot more to do with health. Whether or not this came along and it's a very convenient thing and they've hijacked it, that's for someone else to work out. But have a look at this one. I just wanted to show you this article here. Did you see this one getting around, Charles? Vitamin D supplements don't help ward off colds. Now, they've been pumping this one a bunch of times. I've seen it. Yes, and even another 2 weeks ago, they put it out again. It's like, how dare you? I know for a fact, and I don't care what people say, I can take vitamin D and vitamin D and K, and I do it in the morning. I know my body feels better with vitamin C and supplements when I know I'm not getting enough sleep and things like that.
What I can explain is, you see, all of this is actually fits a pattern. For example, I knew that they'd bring these stories out. They bring them out all the time. And what people don't realise is I'll give an example. How popular would you have been in, say, 1905 if you were talking about cigarette smoking causing cancer? Right?
Yes.
The tobacco company that cigarette smoking caused cancer in 1905. Did you know that? But they didn't admit that, of course, for decades and decades later. So what it really is, I've come to realise, and the other stuff that I've said to you today, these are things that I have factual evidence for, but now here's my own opinion. I really do feel that what's happening in Australia is we have put the worst people in charge. And what they are doing is they're negotiating terms for us overseas, almost like we are a herd of cattle. You've got Jane, who's a global reader, Jane Halton. There's this new sort of global fiefdom. There's these fiefdoms break out. And so you've got these international gatekeepers. So when a company overseas says, hey, you've got 25 million herd of people down in Australia, I wouldn't mind getting a slice of the action. How do I get to inject them with my stuff? Well, you've got to go through Jane. Jane's the gatekeeper, right?
Yep.
And so Jane's whole money, her whole salary, everything is supplied by the very corporations that don't want to talk about the sunshine. They don't want to talk about vitamin D. They don't want to talk about immune system. I mean, talking about your own immune system, I mean, I have bone marrow failure. I have not been able to get a bone marrow transplant. And I do not have a flu or a cold at this moment. And I haven't had a flu or a cold. I get less flus or colds than other people who are normal able-bodied people. And yet when I say that on social media, I get censored. Oh, yeah. So, where are we headed? Okay, well, we're headed to, if I went to a dirty bookstore, I might wear a big raincoat or something and not want me to go in, right? Well, where we're headed to is, I think, we're heading to the immune system being kind of like going to the dirty bookstore, where, it's now going to be seen, that's frowned upon. It's going to be seen as something dirty, something reckless, and possibly even something dangerous. And it's also this new railroad, this new big player in town. And the big player in town is, you don't get to think, you don't get to have a choice. Joan Halton's made it for you. She's better than you are. She's on a higher standing than you are. She's got relationships with people that are smarter than you are. Don't even question it, not even once, and take your medicine. That's where we're headed for.
I'll tell you what we've got to be careful of here is, quite often what happens is people do get accountable, or companies do become accountable, but it's long after the people who are involved are alive. So they just put it off and they put it off, and next thing you know, 50 years later or 40 years later.
By design.
Now, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, well, that's by design. For example, the news that's just come out of the United Kingdom is that 40 years later, the British government has decided to accept liability. Okay, why 40 years? Why 40? Why not 5? Why not 10? Why not 20? Why not 22? Why 40? Well, this is where it's really going to get interesting for people. This is a question I've been asking for some years, and I'll explain why. I was at a mediation meeting in 2004 with the former Chief Justice of the state of New South Wales. His name was Sir Lawrence Street. And we're having a kind of heated mediation meeting. I'm at a meeting with government and other people that are trying to cover up the contaminated blood scandal. So there's some passionate voices in the room. There's bureaucrats that want to keep covering up the fact that they knowingly distributed contaminated blood to kids, and there's me arguing against them. And you've got poor old Sir Lawrence Street as the mediator in the middle. You can imagine trying to keep me calm, sitting opposite Jane Halton type of characters who want to do nothing more than just collect cash for covering up children being harmed. I get quite angry. So Sir Lawrence Street, there's some a table and with some cake and biscuits, and these other senators that day have already had the salmon and lobsters and these opulent meals at taxpayer expense, so they weren't much interested in the almonds, bickies and tea, but I was. I think I caught a train and a bus that morning and walked some distance to get to the meeting, and I've been rained on and I was quite wet, so a hot cup of tea and a biscuit was welcome. And I went over there with the Reverend Bill Cruz, a mate of mine, and I'm having a hot cup of tea and biscuit, and Sir Lawrence Street comes over. Now, we're in this big room, we're having a break. He could be over with the posh senators and the other billionaires in the room, and he doesn't. He comes over to me, and this is what he says. He says, when I first started out in law, I was involved in the Voyager affair. This is HMAS Voyager. This is Australia's deadliest maritime accident, peacetime maritime accident, where an Australian naval ship collided with a British naval ship in the 1960s, and approximately 100 Australian sailors were killed. Well, there was some suggestion that there'd been negligence. There was even suggestion that one of the captains on board the vessels had been drunk. Well, nothing came of it. Victims felt that there'd been a cover-up, and the families couldn't get straight answers, and people who'd lost, the heads of their households couldn't get the support that they needed. And Sir Lawrence Street said, this is the way that they'll handle it. They'll make you wait 40 years, they'll make you wait 40 years to get justice, just like they did with the Voyager, Australia's deadliest maritime accident in the 1960s. So that was he told us that in 2004. So for years I've been walking around saying, okay, 40 years. So you could say that Factor 8, the CSL contaminated blood product that killed 1,400 people, that sort of went into service here in Australia in 1980. So you could sort of say it's been 40 years. Well, lo and behold, suddenly it gets announced in the United Kingdom. The British government, after 40 years, has accepted liability. Well, we think that the Australian government inevitably will have to do the same. So why 40 years? And one of my theories is that when a lot of these corrupt bureaucrats, I mean, I don't know how Jane Halton is. I'm not saying that she's corrupt. I'm saying that she's certainly got a lot of questions to answer. But, and there are various question marks over her head, but she's a bit old now, isn't she? She wouldn't be too far off retirement. But a lot of these bureaucrats are in their mid-40s, okay? So let's just say you're doing a big deal with CSL and you're taking some money and basically you got shares in CSL and they've just killed a whole bunch of kids. Well, you've got to cover it up, right? So what they do is they like to sort of make sure that cover-ups hold for about 40 years. And my theory is, say they're in their mid-40s, a 30-year cover-up takes them to like 75. They get to enjoy, wonderful years of salaries. With that wonderful salaries, they get to put the kids in private school. They love putting the kids in private school, by the way. They're not big fans on your state schools. Private schools, the best universities, maybe an international university. And hell, why not even put down a deposit for the kids too? Because they'll probably want investment properties, all that kind of thing. So that takes them to 75. And why not give them an extra 10 years to enjoy the loot, the money that they've got from Australian taxpayers, millions of dollars. And by the time the 40 years is over, they might be 90 or so, and they'll be too demented to care, and everyone's moved on. So it's almost like a bureaucratic sort of cover-up timeline, is that, okay, there's been a stuff-up, we've killed people en masse, so we'll need to have 30 years minimum so we can finish our careers, an extra 10-year bonus on top so we can enjoy our money, and then we'll be dead and gone, and then some poor young bureaucrat opens up the parcel that's been past the parcel for decades, opens it up and shit, we knowingly infected all these people, or we knowingly screwed all these people with dodgy vaccines. So here's the question. Now that we have this massive rollout with CSL, who are guilty, I mean, CSL are Australia's biggest killers. Nobody's killed more patients with a treatment in Australian history than CSL. And now we're being lined up, millions of us, to take yet more product manufactured by this company. And my question is this. If something goes wrong, will it take us another 40 years before the Jane Haltons of this world will finally one day say, hands up, we got it wrong, and a whole bunch of people got harmed knowingly?
Well, there's so many players involved in this now, and I mean, you'd think she's ran her course, but she seems to be still, I mean, to see something that no one ever touches on Jane is the whole situation with her and Volt, which I find really interesting. Is it's just like she's the intermediary for all these organisations to steer them. Like for instance, she's on ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which spews out a lot of the China propaganda, which are the same, supposedly people that we're fighting against when we're going along with Jane. So that should be a red flag to people.
One that they'll probably conscript us in years to come. They'll start a war and they'll conscript us. And by the way, they're doing deals by them. They've got investments with them over there, but it'll be us working.
Well, the Volt one's interesting was because Volt's got the whole cloud data for the Australian government, which is ridiculous. But the CEO, I can't remember his name, but Jane Halton's the actual chair of that company, and next to her is Dennis Richardson. But Jane has already came out and said that, what's going to happen is our vaccine passport will be linked, whatever, they haven't said what they're going to use it for, but it will be linked to our MyGov account, which Volt runs, which, of course, is getting steered by Jane Halton. Now, that's Volt. Now, I've got an interview I did put on Twitter somewhere with the CEO of Volt, talking about Five Eyes and talking about how they asked him if he had any other interest in this company, how they hold all our data. And he said, our infrastructure is going to be used across the Five Eyes countries. So it seems to me they're building a global database. And
Yes.
it's going to hold more information about us than we can possibly imagine, which then,
Well,
it's interesting, it ties into Jane being on the chair of the Genomics Institute, which then gets into blockchain. Now, it gets really complicated for people, but it's going to be a different world in 10 years, mate. I tell you now.
what people have got to know is that when you've got global leaders like Jane Halton, and she is a global leader, and I'll explain what I mean. She might not be a leader to, haemophiliacs that have died en masse. She might not be a leader to millions of people that might be coerced into having a vaccine against their will. But to Bill Gates and the people that are running the show on public health, she's the global leader. She's the go-to guy. And I've heard rumours, I don't know if they're true, but I've heard rumours from other investigators, I've heard rumours from journalists around the world that, pretty much if you want to do anything down here in any size on health, you've got to go see Jane first. And like if you want to move product down here, for example, a lot of people don't know is that Australia is one of the first choices for product experimentation in health. So, for example, medical devices. If a company can't get their medical device approved in Europe, where do they go? Well, one of the open secrets is what they call the open sewer. That's Australia's regulators. What they do is they head on down to Australia because they know that it'll get approved. But one of the rumours is that they ring up people like Jane Halton, they ring up the TGA, they talk money, they talk Turkey, what it is they want to get done. They make sure to look after the right people, and that product gets approved. I mean, I think there was a story just a couple of years ago about a heart pump, effectively like an artificial heart, that was experimental, and no decent regulator was going to allow this crazy shit. And guess what? It got approved for use here in Australia, and the patients died, and the company knew it would get approved, and they wanted it used here in Australia so they could say when they went to the better regulators, oh yeah, you can have this, it's fine. Look, the Australians approved it. So that's kind of what Australia's seen as. It's sort of seen as a place you can go off and do deals. So if they have their global leader goes overseas. You want to get something done, move a lot of products, sell a lot of stuff, put devices and experiments into people, you talk to Australia. You see?
Unbelievable. I mean...
Yeah, it is unbelievable.
I feel like Greg is a bigger player almost as much as Jane, and I'll tell you why. Now, just get your ideas on this. I mean, well, just as I'm talking to you, I'm just looking at this image. You saw that footage of him recently where he said, the world is engaged in the largest clinical trial, which is true. I'm surprised he actually said it. But it's interesting, his history, because if you look at Jane, she came over really young from England, right? And I believe there's so much behind this through the Wellcome Trust, which is, English.
That's part. It's a very good point you mentioned. She came from England, and this is so key. Please keep going because it's tied into.
I just find it interesting when I look at Greg Hunt's history as well. It's just that he came from I have to remember University Fulbright, one of the Fulbright institutes, which is quite often where they groom these people. And then all of a sudden he went to Israel for a year, but then out of that straight away gets a job at the World Economic Forum as a strategist, right? And people say, oh, it was only for a year. Well, my point is, I don't think these people are ever unofficially left these positions. And because you can go back a couple, and I did put it up while you were talking earlier. I mean, there's talk of him maybe in 2017, Hunt talking about linking vaccine passports up back then, I believe it was, It's like these guys have been pushing this agenda where all these guys are linked through, organisations, the WEF, and same thing with Jane. It's like, okay, they come in and they've got free reign to go.
It's a cabal of bureaucracy, and what it is it's England is a main, or the United Kingdom is a main offender, and what they do is they have like some countries produce great athletes. Well, I don't think you could ever accuse the British of producing great athletes, but they produce bureaucrats, almost like a conveyor belt of bureaucrats. And this ties into contaminated blood, because what happened with blood was there was a lot of money moving around. They did it in the UK. Money's going to blood brokers, American pharmaceutical companies who are making factor VIII blood products. There's all this money happening. And the same bureaucrats involved in the British decisions are making decisions down in Australia. They're talking to each other all of the time, okay? So to give an example of the close nature, they would send British bureaucrats down to manage the contaminated blood scandal in Australia. The people they sent down to manage the hepatitis C outbreak in Australia were English, okay? So it's always England, this thing where they're going back and fro, back and fro. And to give an example of the level of this sort of bureaucratic cabal, this cartel of international bureaucrats that seem to be on the same page of doing deals for themselves and you know, very interested in tracking systems and very interested in vaccines, right? Is when the first HIV litigation was happening in Australia, where you've got children who are being denied help by the Australian government. They've got AIDS from the blood product that they were given by CSL. When they had to go to court, when they were forced to go to court against the Australian government to try and get help, what did they do? They reached out to British authorities to help them defend those cases. Why would a sovereign nation, when it infects Australian children with HIV from a contaminated blood product, why would it be looking for money and legal expertise from the United Kingdom to defend its own cases? Why? Because they're all interconnected.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
They're all interconnected. What's what we Australians think we've got sovereignty? What a load of baloney, mate.
Absolutely. The whole talk of this whole thing where we're going, we've got to keep, you know, Australia sovereign because we're coming, you know, and it sounds conspiratorial, but it's a real thing. You can listen to people talk about it. You know, the term one world order, you know, new world order. You know what? We're already there. And
well, I mean, those terms, new world order and one world order, I don't use them.
No, but they've been hijacked now into tinfoil hat material, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, but also because I think it actually is a little too exotic in how it sounds.
Yes.
I'm going to go for something a little bit simpler. And I want to call it an order of self-interest. Okay, and what you've got is you follow the money and follow the self-interest. And the bureaucrats, I have to be honest, particularly the senior ones, and it's just been my experience. Okay, I just got to tell you something. They are corrupted very easily. Okay, very, very easily. You've heard of the honey trap. Okay, that the Chinese.
Look, I believe there's two sides of it. I believe just on the honey trap. And look, this, if anyone's listening to this and looked at any of the insane part of my life last year where I happened to walk into something and it happened in a country town, and it was me and my partner, and we stumbled into something that was, I won't say any names now, that was absolutely absurd and got into what I believe is a child trafficking network, right? And I'm not someone who believes any of this stuff about 300,000 children getting rescued, because I believe a lot of that stuff comes down to muddying the waters to hide the truth of what is happening. But I'll tell you now, mate, there was 2 weeks of my life where I was on the ground, out driving my car every day, taking photos, meeting people, and I swear I found something that was unbelievable, a child trafficking network, and to the point that we got out of there and I thought, maybe I'm losing my fucking mind, me and my partner. Then I got contacted by a Chinese girl. And this is where it blows my mind, because this came into her showing me a photo of this person's wife, holding up a photo of this person's wife, accusing her or her father of being a member of the world's largest pedophile network. Now, this is something I didn't even know about, right? And it's hard for me to explain it without saying names. But I just stumbled onto this completely. I did not know about this at all. And then for a month later, I guess it was, someone to contact me, show a video from China with this person's wife coming up in accusations that she's a spy and running one of the world's biggest honey traps in frigging Victoria, Australia. I honestly nearly fell down crying, like, oh my God, I'm not losing my fucking mind. And this is coming from someone who I know is definitely untrustworthy. It was linked to Steve Bannon. So I know there's stuff where there's propaganda mixed with a lot of bullshit, but it's really happening, mate. And between the honey trap's real.
So think about that then. Have you noticed in the age of perhaps before COVID-19, but we had all of this great communication developments, didn't we? We could talk on the phone anywhere. We could talk on Skype, all of these amazing things. And yet these bureaucrats are still being flown all around the world. They're still being flown in the best airlines, the best seats, the best hotels, right?
Yep.
And all frequent trips. And what's going on? I mean, the rest of us are making do with Skype when we're talking to people overseas, but they're always going overseas and they're always staying away, right? Well, that's why I say with this idea of New World Order and all the rest of it, why do we have to be that flamboyant? Why does it have to be something that could be something associated with something conspiratorial? Why can't we just go down?
Yeah, we like to simplify things, you know.
Yeah, well, follow the self-interest. I mean, listen. If we allow cricketers to bet on the games they're playing in, what outcome do you think you're going to get for that cricket match? All right? Now, here's how simple it is for anyone listening. If anyone really wants to know what to do, what we've really got to do is, okay, we've got to say no. That's the first thing. And how do you say no? Well, at the moment, I actually think we should have a pause on vaccination. I think people should learn more about their own immune systems. And just while we're waiting for Jane Halton to start regathering her memory, when she's being asked questions of inquiries into very disturbing things like Crown Casino, and she gets amnesia and she can't remember, well, I think that's an automatic strikeout. I think that's it. She's got to stand down. We cannot have that, okay? We cannot have that. We cannot have millions of people being injected by something that may have concerns, that may have issues. We've got reports of blood clotting deaths overseas. There are serious questions. We cannot have bureaucrats in charge of this process who have these question marks over them and their integrity. We just cannot have it. It is just that simple, okay? It is just that simple. We cannot have someone flying a plane drunk. We cannot have bureaucrats that are implicated with sudden losses of memory because there might be skullduggerous behaviour.
Well, that's, once again, we always rely on our media to drag things into the open, but their silence is complicit in this, and that's...
The other thing we've got to do is we have to work out now, I guess, what do we do? How do we consume media going forward? What is trustworthy media? What should we be cautious of? And in fact, the great irony here is that perhaps it's the case that they used to poo-poo people looking up Google and getting their facts off social media. I actually think you're more likely to get the correct information from social media now than you are from the mainstream media.
If you've got to filter it out yourself, and it's coming down to just, I mean, who am I? I'm just a person trying to get your message out there, you know. But
who you are is actually very important in this sense, because you're an Australian that sees that there's questions. And yet if we were to ask Jane Halton, we had Jane right here, Jane would say that there's no reason to look at contaminated blood. She'd say that she's very happy with the inquiry that she helped arrange in 2004 that found that no haemophiliac should be helped at all. She'd say that it makes total sense that CSL were indemnified after killing 1,400 haemophiliacs. That all we're going to get from these people is nothing but the company line. And what do companies care about? They care about the bottom line. Okay? So we've just got to be realistic. It's how we consume media, all right? If you're watching the ABC expecting to get the truth about what's really happening with COVID-19, you'll be sorely disappointed. Why? They clearly have a relationship with CSL. I mean, when you look at, for example, the global contaminated blood scandal, every other public broadcaster has investigated and reported it in their country, but not the ABC. Why? Because Australia is home to the world's largest blood products manufacturer, CSL. It's also one of the world's largest flu vaccine manufacturers. Australia doesn't have too many, $120 billion, $140 billion companies. And when we do, they kind of become a big thing. CSL is Australia's equivalent of Apple, okay? And the ABC are in the shadow of that company. They're in the shadow of it. I mean, people think that the ABC, right now there's some people saying, oh, the ABC, they're too far left. Or there's others that may be thinking they're too conservative. Who knows, right?
Yes.
Oh, the ABC, they're so far left, all they care about is attacking the Liberal government. What a load of bullshit. They let you think that. That's part of the distraction, part of the plan. Liberal government, they don't want to talk about supposed global warming. The ABC do. That's part of the way that they give you the idea that there's some sort of separation of editorial control, right? No. What there is the ABC is taxpayer funded, and they get their budgets from the ABC, and they know that if they go anywhere near CSL, their budget is immediately at risk.
Wow. What do we expect to see from you in the future, Charles? From here, obviously, I think you're going to be playing a part in this case, I believe, in the UK. You'll be making a statement. Is that correct? Or
I've been a witness in that inquiry. I have been cooperating with the largest legal inquiry in British history, which is into their deadliest ever medical scandal. What do we expect to see from me? Well, I hope to be alive. I hope to remain alive. It's very stressful doing this, and unfortunately, because there's a lot of money involved and a lot of death involved, there are also some baddies involved.
So you've spent days since that video, as we said at the start, you've just been hacked non-stop. Yes,
we've got very good security on a lot of our accounts, but unfortunately, we've have non-stop hacking attempts, and maybe some of them have got through. But yeah, ever since that video, and I've showed you some of the evidence, and I'll continue to show the evidence. I want anyone who's interested, if they want to follow us, I'd like to give them a bird's eye view, so that they're not just hearing what we're saying. I want them to see pretty much daily the sort of stuff that happens. I mean, I've had people tell me I'm going to be murdered. I've been warned off. I mean, murdered. This is Australia. And let me explain. I was harmed as a child. Perhaps there are child sex abuse victims that have gone public about things. And what are they to be murdered about that too? Murdered by the priest that assaulted them? This is beyond, right, worrying. And am I worried about it? No, I'm angry about it. I went into a hospital as a child, and I bumped into this terrible nightmare, contaminated blood. So to those people that are hacking us, and to those people that are trying to let me know that, my life's in danger, none of this is going to help you, okay? And I have to say that probably one or two of our British allies who are watching this, who know that it's inevitable that the truth's going to come out in Australia. Just anything that happens to me, the show goes on. It's not going to make a difference, okay? But it actually just makes me a lot angrier and a lot more determined. I think you're utterly vile. I really do.
Well, I'll cut that part up, and I'll tell you what, we'll share that out there. Okay.
Right.
Because this is the thing. If you've got a podcast, guys, Charles, you've been doing this now for over 20 years, and your history is not just in terms of protest movements, and what's a little bit of your history going back into other movements or activism, I should say. What's your activist history? I know you've mentioned it briefly to me.
Well, what's happened is that obviously I first came into contact with understanding about contaminated blood when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And that was in the 90s. And it's the sort of thing, I wasn't a victim, by the way, when I first found out about contaminated blood. That's the other irony.
That is.
I wasn't. Yeah, I started looking before I became a victim. So when I was getting the blood, I knew that I'd become infected. And I knew that because a kid that I'd gone to school with had been given HIV/AIDS from a blood product, and they were treating him abysmally. And we all knew that they were making an example of this 11-year-old kid that they'd infected with AIDS. And I remember thinking then, there's something terrible going on. I don't care if you've got a white coat or letters before or after your name, or you're called a professor with a long beard. You're treating a kid like that, there's something wrong with you, or there's something that's not right. And so what happened was I then got into blood, and then through the horror and disappointment of that, I understood, wow, what else is this happening in? And then I discovered a formula. And the formula is basically this. It's not just about blood. Large organisations, companies and governments do this across the board in many different areas. And so I then decided to investigate and research for other groups of people that might not be able to defend themselves or even know that bad things were going on. And so I've done it anonymously sometimes, or I've put my name to it. I have done quite a number of campaigns over the years, and I held forums for Bali bombing victims who, they had a similar problem to us, where everyone thought, oh, you're in such a great country, Australia, which we are, but they've been given millions of dollars, and they didn't have the heart to tell people, actually, I'm actually collecting the dole. I haven't received 1 cent. And the Red Cross withheld it all, but made sure to tell the public, oh, we're making sure to give all these people their lives back, when they kept them without money for ages. And so I exposed that. We're able to get those people aid, and they needed it. And that was a great thing. And it's because I remember I spoke to an Irish contaminated blood campaigner who unfortunately is dead, but she helped expose their deadliest medical scandal in Ireland, and a former journalist. And I asked her, I said, why'd you do it? Because she's ill. Why would you, if you're ill with hepatitis C, you hardly want to be a campaigner for it, bloody hell, why? And she said, because I don't want anybody else to suffer unnecessarily in the same way ever again. And actually, I'll tell you this right now, how it feels like. Imagine you've been really badly harmed, or someone you care about's been raped, savagely raped. Would you just go off to your job as an architect the next day, or whatever it is you were formerly doing, and be the same? Maybe you would be. That doesn't mean to say you wouldn't care, but what if you did go back to who you were? What about if you just couldn't stand the idea that there are others in the firing line, that you could actually stop someone else from being harmed today, this moment right now, from having their whole life destroyed? What would you do? And that is me in a nutshell. Every day I go through it, every day. If there's just one extra person that we can pull back and not have to be in this nightmare, to understand that your best bet, your safest bet doesn't come with Jane Halton or through people like that. It comes through you. Okay? So if you can do things to look after yourself, that doesn't mean you have to take a mass manufactured product. You've got an immune system in you, use it, build it, strengthen it, nourish it, and it'll be your best friend. And it'll keep you out of the clutches of companies that just want to use you as an extra sale.
Mate, you couldn't have said it any better. I tell you what, absolutely unbelievable.
It is the truth, Pete. I swear to God, this, I like none of it, like this is exactly, I
you're
feel
living
this.
and breathing this. And listen, we'll wrap it up, but there's some information that I know we haven't even released yet, and maybe we don't need to. But I remember one time you stumbled on something, and I remember they had to carry you out of a building when you found that discovery. And that's because you're living and breathing, and after 20 years, you've never given up on your research. Now,
well, let's. Would you like me to talk briefly about that?
I don't know how deep you can go into that, but love you to. Yeah.
Okay. So, what I thought you and I could do is, the reason today we're talking a lot about the incredible development in the United Kingdom, where after 40 years of lying, cheating, and various other criminal actions, the British government has admitted liability for the worst atrocity in the history of British healthcare, contaminated blood. And what happened was, we've been told by Jane Halton and others who run our country's healthcare that we didn't have a contaminated blood scandal in Australia. What they tell us is that, yes, contaminated blood scandals happen in every other country, but Australia, it had the safest blood supply in the world, and 1 or 2 people got HIV/AIDS from blood transfusions. It was unavoidable. It was tragic. It was part of the whole wider AIDS tragedy. There was nothing to be done, and very sad. And if you keep asking questions, maybe you might be a discriminatory person. Maybe there might be something odd about you. Okay, so we were just told, look, anything that happened was unavoidable, and actually everything that was done with best science advice. And so for the best part of 33 years, I've walked under the cloud, not from people that know me and not from victims, but from bureaucrats and from the media and millions of others maybe who look at tainted blood and thought to be a liar, and just thought to be a activist who is just trying to cause distress in people's lives, whatever crazy idea they have, right? And so one day last year, we were producing a timeline, and we have a very good member of ours, and she's got a high profile. And so she said, I'd like to have a timeline to show people. Could you go make me one? So I thought, yeah, we'll do that. And so we'd done timelines in the past, but upon this new creation of this new timeline, I'd heard a crazy lead, and it was a crazy lead to do with the Australian government having a knowing policy of using high-risk donors. Well, right, so what happened was this particular allegation that had been made, I just thought was too far-fetched. And so I didn't really want to go and check it out. But, it's one of those things where you've got to go anyway, just to cross it off your list.
Yeah.
So you're going to sacrifice a whole day. So I went into this place to find this evidence, this library, and we're going through it. And lo and behold, hidden for the best part of 40 years is categoric evidence that the Australian government and the Australian Red Cross had a policy of collecting blood from infectious donors or high-risk donors. So what we're told is when you manage a blood supply, if people want to donate blood, we've been told that they screen the blood for viruses, and any blood to be found to be infectious is discarded, not to be used. Or we're told that someone who might be at risk of having a virus would be asked not to donate, and therefore that blood wouldn't go into the system. Well, that's what we've been told for decades, right? So I find this evidence, and it's an advertisement. It's an advertisement calling for blood donors from high-risk groups, from the groups that they knew to be at the most chance of having a virus. We found evidence that they were asking people inside jails to donate blood, that they were sending Red Cross blood vans to people using heroin in jail who were sharing needles. These are people with heroin addictions, so, which is, of course, is a risk when you're sharing needles. It's a risk for things like hepatitis and HIV, right? They knew this, and yet they were sending blood vans to collect blood from these prisoners who were using drugs. And then those blood vans would go directly to CSL, who would then create these blood products and then export them to children all around the world. They exported them to children in Hong Kong with haemophilia. They exported to children in Singapore. They exported them in Indonesia. And they'd come from this high-risk donors. So here I am in this library looking at this advertisement in what has to be said is a sexually explicit newspaper. And there it is, an advertisement. In other editions of this newspaper they used to advertise for donors in, they're talking about this new emerging virus called HIV or a similar name to it. And they're talking about the threat of hepatitis. And then as you turn the pages, suddenly they're saying that, to the readers of this newspaper, we'd like you to come donate blood. I felt incredibly weak. It's like, imagine if you're an archaeologist and you've been searching for the Holy Grail. You're Indiana Jones or someone, and you find this thing, the greatest discovery ever, and you're expecting to hear angels sing and harps playing.
No, because the reality kicks in of people being used and abused.
It was, so what happened was I expected to see this thing like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and the proof that I've been after, I find it, and oh my God, here it is. You know what happened? I go weak, and I actually had to be helped out. I was planning on catching the bus home that day. I'm a bit thrifty in that way, but I couldn't. I had to get in a taxi because I could not reliably stand up. All the strength just went from me. And it was like, fuck, I've been called a liar for the best part of 40 years. I've had friends who died under the cloud being liars. And here we are, right in front of our faces, proof positive that we're not liars, they're liars. And worst of all, this evidence that we found seems to implicate that there were other parties involved, not just the Red Cross, not just Australia's biggest company, CSL, who are guilty of Australia's deadliest medical scandal, but also American pharmaceutical companies were involved. We see possible links to the World Health Organization. It is amazing. It is just amazing. It's one of the reasons why I actually don't think this scandal is safe or could be investigated with any reliability in this country. And this is why I've gone overseas in search of more reputable sort of investigations and systems overseas that could, find out why this was so wrong.
Yes, and I've seen the groups that you're talking about. I don't know that these groups aren't normally allowed to give blood. Is there a time? Are you going to release that timeline anytime soon, or what's the go?
Yeah. We are going to release it. It looks to be happening in April.
Yeah,
and
in Australia, I've seen it, and oh my God, no wonder they're trying to hack you, mate. But I tell you now, enough people have got this and haven't released it already. So call it a dead man's switch, if you will, but it's already out there.
Well, for people trying to understand the gravity or significance of this, I'll just explain. So the Australian government, Jane Halton, CSL, the Red Cross, the Kirby Institute, just about every think tank that's on CSL money, and there's a lot of them, has said that Australia's deadliest medical scandal, contaminated blood, was an unavoidable accident, and that actually what happened was done with the best science advice. And a lot of these, you remember, a lot of these bureaucrats who've said this over the years, they've become quite angry at victims because I've had them shout at me. I've had some say, that, I'm one of the most ungrateful people on earth. I should be dead without the blood. Ungrateful, and that I received the best possible blood. I mean, we had the best blood supply in the world, and really, we are, the least grateful people going. Well, when you see the evidence that we've now found, I think the people that lever those accusations at victims, I think they need to hang their heads in shame for eternity, because the evidence is overwhelming. What liars you are. The idea that this was an accident. Are you kidding? Are you kidding? This was an accident. You wait to, when people see evidence, the one thing this was an accident. But the other thing too is, I want to make clear, is guess what? When the government use high-risk donors, who do they blame for causing tainted blood? They blame the high-risk donors. So, for example, they'll say,
and then they advertise and wait to see where they're advertising.
They're the ones that recruited them. And then soon as the contaminated blood scandal comes out, they start saying, oh, well, it was the prisoners that were donating blood. We're going to have to tell them to stop donating blood. Stop sending the vans there, you idiots. Telling us you're going to have to...
Talking about, I mean, just so we're clear, I mean, the timeline's not just going to be prisoners. I can tell you that now. But back onto the prisoner part, there is a high-profile prisoner that's involved in this too, isn't it? Can you...
Oh, there's many.
Look, name or not?
Not just yet, but there are some high-profile characters involved, or infamous characters, might add.
Yes, I would say.
And what people got to understand is, why would they? For example, one of the questions is, I don't believe this. Why would the Australian Red Cross collect blood from guys that they know who are doing drugs in jail? Okay, why would they? Because it just doesn't make sense. Why would they? All right, in order for you to understand the motivations why, you've got to understand more about the 1980s. Now, again, if you look at South America in the 1980s, you'll see narco states. Well, if you look at Australia in the 1980s, you'll see a blood state. And there's a lot of money being paid for blood. And this blood's moving all around the world. In America, they had blood brokers, and they were collecting blood from American prisons, and they were exporting those American prisoner blood all around the world. And it was killing people. Bill Clinton was involved. The former president of the United States, when he was governor of Arkansas, he was having his jails knowingly export. He was on the take. He was getting money for this. Okay, he profited from this, right? So what people don't understand is this was a global enterprise with global dealers. So you've got the narco states, they're pushing coke. Well, you've got these blood states like Australia, and they're pushing the blood products all over the place. So you've got all of this stuff happening. So you've got to understand this stuff is such a valuable resource. It's like, keep it coming in, man. If they could smuggle it up people's bottoms, they would have.
Charles, thanks, mate. I've never done a podcast before, so thank you very much.
Well, you think that you had, because I feel very much as though I've been on the ABC. You asked better questions than the ABC, and you seem more determined to get answers. So the presentation was just as smooth, but the questions were that bit more, I won't say probing, but that bit better.
So just summarise quickly with the good news. So let's leave people with a positive message about that article where we started. So just summarise that for us and we'll wrap it up, mate.
As gloomy and as horrifying as something like contaminated blood can be, Australia's deadliest medical scandal, isn't it fantastic to hear that this will not ultimately have the worst ending? Because the United Kingdom, culpable British authorities that had so much to do with the scandal down here in Australia, including involved in, potentially being involved in children getting AIDS and hepatitis C needlessly due to British government blood policies and protocols and all of this stuff that went terribly wrong for us in Australia. The fact that they've admitted liability means that we could actually be seeing for the first time the chance for justice for not just British victims, but Australian victims of the global contaminated blood scandal as well. So for us, I'll tell you what it feels like. Imagine you've been under a sort of Nazi occupation and a terrible things happen to you, and you've been, subjugated for decades and ruined, to find out that you're about to be liberated. That's the positive feeling that we have.
Thank you so much, man.